December 16th, 1944. 5:30 a.m., Schnee-Eifel Ridge, Ardennes Forest. The pre-dawn silence is shattered by a sudden eruption of artillery. Shells rain down on the American lines, from nimble 81mm mortars to massive 16-inch railway guns. Trees splinter and foxholes erupt in gouts of earth. GIs of the U.S. 106th Infantry Division, who only moments before were shivering in the pre-dawn cold, now grab their helmets and huddle low as the ghost front explodes into life. In one muddy foxhole, a young American soldier presses himself into the frozen ground, heart pounding. A half-finished cigarette dangles forgotten between his fingers as rounds whistle overhead. He'd been savoring a chunk of his breakfast chocolate ration bar just minutes earlier, a small comfort on a quiet front. Now that chocolate lies trampled into the mud as chaos engulfs the ridge. The battle of the bulge has begun, and the tranquil Ardennes is suddenly an inferno of noise and fire. After an eternity of 45 blistering minutes, the barrage lifts. The GY blinks through the acrid smoke. In the eerie post-bombardment hush at 6:15 a.m., ghostly shapes emerge in the morning mist. Vague figures in white snowsuits flitted along the front, one witness recalled for. German assault troops, clad in winter camouflage, rush through the pines. The clatter of tank treads echoes off the snowy ground. Heart pounding, the American soldier raises his rifle as those figures close in. The quiet sector he woke up in has vanished. It's now kill or be killed on the Schnee-Eifel. Just days before this explosion of violence, the scene on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge had been entirely different. The 106th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Golden Lions, arrived in the Ardennes only on December 10th, 1944, relieving the veteran 2nd Division. They took up positions in what Allied troops jokingly called the Ghost Front, a quiet sector of the front so inactive it hardly seemed like a war zone. The ridge they occupied protruded into German territory in a forested highland known as the Schnee-Eifel. Snow covered the timbered slopes, the cold seeped into soldiers' bones. Still, by World War II standards, it was almost idyllic. No major combat, just routine patrols and standing guard in primitive log bunkers. Yet, all was not as calm as it appeared. The 106th Division was green and stretched perilously thin. Its 14,000 soldiers were spread over a 22-mile front, far wider than the 6 miles considered prudent for a division. They manned a string of villages and pillboxes inherited from previous units, many in low-lying sugar bowl valleys surrounded by overlooking hills. Ammunition was scarce. The division's artillery had received no resupply since landing in France, and they had begged and borrowed shells just to have a basic load. Winter gear was lacking too. Most men had not yet received overshoes or extra sweaters, and cases of frostbite began appearing within days. General Allen W. Jones, the division commander, grew uneasy. He and his staff knew their line was overextended and vulnerable. Every night, strange rumbling noises drifted from the German side of the lines, engines revving in the darkness. The Americans didn't realize it, but they were hearing the buildup of a massive enemy force. Higher headquarters dismissed these reports, insisting the Germans were just playing recordings to scare the new troops. Reassured that nothing would happen in this quiet sector, the Golden Lions settled into defensive routine, unaware of the storm about to hit. Meanwhile, across no man's land in the dark forests of the Eifel, the Germans were preparing a colossal surprise. This was Hitler's last gamble, Operation Wacht am Rhein, a counter-offensive designed to pierce the Western Front. By mid-December, 30 German divisions with 1,900 artillery pieces and nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns had secretly massed in the Ardennes. Their plan: burst through the thin American lines, drive all the way to Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. 12. The 106th Division sat directly in the path of General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. Manteuffel's scheme for that sector was audacious. He would encircle and destroy the Americans on the Schnee Eifel with one pincer, while his panzer divisions bypassed to the north and south. The task of encirclement fell to the 18th Volksgrenadier Division, a rebuilt German unit familiar with the terrain after months on static duty. On the American flanks stood the veteran 28th Infantry Division to the south, and the 14th Cavalry Group, a mechanized reconnaissance force, to the north, 15. If the Germans could punch through those flanks and meet behind the Schnee Eifel, the 106th would be trapped in a vise. It was a classic double envelopment, and the Americans had no inkling it was coming. Life for the soldiers in those final quiet hours was deceptively normal. In snowy foxholes, GIs passed the time writing letters, cleaning weapons, and eating their K-Rations. The U.S. Army prided itself on giving its troops high-energy field rations, and the K-Ration packs provided a taste of home: tins of meat or cheese, crackers, powdered coffee, a sugar tablet, even candy, gum, or a chocolate bar in each meal. Each K-Ration box also contained a little accessory pack with essentials like water purification tablets, matches, and a few cigarettes. For a GI in the Ardennes, a morning coffee and a quick smoke were routine comforts, even out in the snow. Across the lines, German Lancer, infantrymen, also clung to small comforts. Their rations were heavier on black bread, sausage, and barley soup, but the Wehrmacht made sure every soldier got his tobacco, typically an allotment of 6 cigarettes per day as part of the field marching ration. A German grenadier might light one up to steady his nerves in the pre-dawn cold, just as an American GI struck a match to go with his chewing gum. Both armies understood that such simple luxuries, a cigarette to calm anxiety, a piece of candy to boost morale, could be as indispensable as bullets in sustaining a soldier's spirit. That chilly December 16th, the men of the 106th awoke before dawn as usual and trudged to their positions on the ridgeline. They expected another uneventful day on a quiet front. Many likely unwrapped a D-ration chocolate bar or biscuit for breakfast, or joked with a buddy while nibbling on cold rations. Officers had just reminded everyone to stay alert. There were vague reports of enemy activity, but nothing concrete. In reality, tens of thousands of German troops were slipping into their attack jump-off points under cover of darkness. The stage was set. In a few moments, the comfortable lull would be over, and those cigarettes and chocolates would go from minor pleasures to instruments of survival and solace. When the German bombardment thundered down at 5:30 a.m., it transformed the Ghost Front into a front line of terror. American soldiers, jolted awake by the jolt of the first shells, stumbled out of huts and dugouts into a blizzard of shrapnel. Communication lines were cut in the first minutes, plunged into static by shell bursts. At division headquarters, clerks and even the military band grabbed rifles and ran out to establish a defensive perimeter. Supply trucks and jeeps parked along the roads went up in flames as salvo after salvo crashed down. "This can't be real," one stunned private yelled as he cowered in a trench. But it was very real. The 106th Division was caught in Hitler's surprise attack. Then, as suddenly as it began, the barrage lifted. In the stunned silence, the Americans peeked over their snowbank parapets and saw the enemy coming. Waves of German infantry in white camouflage smocks were storming forward through the trees. They whooped and shouted, firing as they advanced. Panzers and assault guns loomed behind them, engine noise growing to a roar. An American machine gunner on the line finally snapped to his senses and squeezed the trigger. The cacophony of battle resumed, this time with rifles cracking and machine guns rattling from the American side, joined by the crump of mortars and the bark of tank guns from the Germans. The men of the 106th, though dazed, began to fight back for their lives. Along the division's broad front, pockets of fierce resistance flared up. In the northern sector, at a hamlet called Kreewinkel, a troop of the 14th Cavalry Group and a handful of attached tank destroyers found themselves nearly surrounded by enemy paratroopers. These American cavalrymen were scouts, not line infantry, but they fought tenaciously. All morning, German 3rd Parachute Division units assaulted Kriwinkel, and each time the outnumbered Americans beat them back. After one failed charge, the frustrated Germans hollered across the snowy field, "Take a 10-minute break. We'll be back." One GI shouted in reply, "We'll still be here." And incredibly, they were. The cavalrymen held Kriwinkel for hours, exacting a heavy price on the attackers. Similar skirmishes played out in other villages and bunker lines. Elements of the 424th Infantry Regiment, on the division's right flank, ambushed Germans in the woods, stalling an advance by the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division with well-placed machine gun fire. Near Bleialf, on the southern end of the Schnee-Eifel, the commander of the 423rd Infantry Regiment hastily threw together a scratch force of cooks, clerks, and engineers to counterattack a German penetration. In desperate house-to-house fighting, they actually recaptured the village of Bleialf from the 18th Volksgrenadiers for most of the day. These local successes proved that not every American unit collapsed. Many GIs fought with valor and resourcefulness despite the shock. But the German onslaught was overwhelming. They had achieved complete surprise, and they had numbers on their side. By midday on December 16th, entire American platoons and companies were isolated or falling back. The 14th Cavalry's thin screen on the northern flank was infiltrated and cut to pieces by armored groups driving through the Losheim Gap. After a heroic stand, Kriwinkel and other outposts were finally bypassed or overrun by sheer weight of enemy armor and infantry. Under crushing pressure, Colonel Devine of the 14th Cavalry Group ordered his surviving troops to escape west if they could. Small groups of U.S. scouts slipped through the woods, but many others were surrounded and forced to surrender. Within the first day, the cavalry screen on the flank had essentially been destroyed. Losses were later tallied at over 50% of the group's vehicles and 1/3 of its men. This collapse opened a gaping hole in the American lines. Through that gap surged armored spearheads that drove behind the main American infantry positions on the Schnee-Eifel. By late December the 16th, German vanguards from the 18th Volksgrenadier Division and 5th Panzer Army linked up north and south of the Schnee-Eifel, executing their planned envelopment. The two front-line regiments of the 106th, around 7,000 men of the 422nd and 423rd Regiments, suddenly found themselves cut off from all sides. They were trapped in the forests east of the tiny crossroads village of Schönberg, with German units blocking every road out. The division commander, General Jones, had by that evening committed every reserve he had, including his engineer battalion, in futile attempts to plug holes or counterattack. Nothing could restore the front. The Golden Lion's Den was surrounded, its fate uncertain. Day 2, December 17th. Overnight, a blizzard blew in, cloaking the Ardennes in snow and fog. The two besieged American regiments on the Schnee-Eifel hunkered down in defensive circles on the high ground. Through radio messages, they learned that help might be on the way. Armored Combat Command units from the U.S. 7th Armored and 9th Armored Divisions were scrambling to counterattack from the west. The encircled GIs just had to hold out. All day on the 17th, they withstood probing attacks from German infantry and tanks encircling their perimeter. The Americans had plenty of fight left, but not plenty of supplies. Their greatest enemies quickly became hunger, cold, and dwindling ammunition. Many had only what food they carried in pockets and packs. Men began splitting K-Rations to share with buddies. Tins of cheese and packets of crackers were carefully rationed out. Some soldiers had stashed an emergency chocolate bar, originally intended as a last resort calorie boost, and now nibbled it slowly to stave off hunger pangs. Water was obtained by melting snow in helmets over small fires. though making any fire risked drawing enemy mortar fire. Ammunition was running critically low. The trapped regiments had no resupply and had expended much of their stock, slowing the German assaults. Even the division artillery batteries with them were nearly out of shells. They'd started the battle short on ammo and now had fired almost everything they had. By the night of the 17th, many infantrymen were down to their last bandolier of rifle cartridges. The wounded piled up in aid stations set up in cellars and bunkers, but medical supplies were scarce. Frostbite gnawed at toes and fingers in the sub-freezing cold. Still, the Americans endured, hoping relief would break through the German cordon. That hope dwindled as reports came in. Allied air support was grounded by bad weather, so no supply drops could get through the low clouds, and the armored relief columns from the west kept hitting German roadblocks and ambushes. They could not reach the encircled 106th in time. The men on the Schnee Eifel were on their own. Day 3, December 18th. By now, the situation was dire. The German ring constricted tighter around the Schnee Eifel pocket. Desperate, Major General Jones issued orders to his trapped regiments attempt a breakout towards American lines. Before dawn on the 18th, under cover of darkness and swirling snow, the 422nd and 423rd Regiments formed up for a last gamble. Leaving behind many of their heaviest guns and excess gear, the column of wearied GIs began moving west along the only viable route, a road through Schönberg leading toward St. Vith. Their plan was to fight their way out of encirclement and link up with friendly forces. At first light, the breakout started. Columns of American infantry and remaining vehicles cautiously advanced down a forest road toward Schönberg. But the Germans had anticipated such a move. As the lead elements reached the outskirts of Schönberg, German mortars and machine guns opened up with deadly precision. The road ahead erupted in fire. An elite formation, the Führer Begleit Brigade, Hitler's Guards Brigade, had hurried forward to reinforce the trap. Now, German paratroopers and armored vehicles poured volleys into the Americans from high ground near the village. Caught in the open, the American breakout column stood little chance. Men fell by the dozens as machine gun fire swept the icy road. Artillery shells bracketed the column, blowing apart trucks and scattering bodies in the snow. Under this ambush, the breakout ground to a halt. Some platoons tried to rush the German positions but were cut down. Others dispersed into the woods, only to be surrounded by roaming enemy tanks. After a few hours of chaotic fighting, the survivors of the 422nd and 423rd retreated back onto the Schnee Eifel high ground, bloodied, exhausted, and now completely out of options. The breakout had failed. The noose was fully tightened. On the night of December 18th, the remaining officers of the trapped American force took stock. They had thousands of hungry, depleted men, many with no ammo to even resist another attack. They had wounded who would not survive without proper care. No help would arrive in time. In these desperate hours, some groups of GIs attempted individual escapes through the dark forests. A few small bands actually slipped past the Germans and made it to Allied lines. A notable few from an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon managed to reach St. Vith. But for the vast majority, there was no escape. Rather than face annihilation, the regimental commanders decided the only humane option was surrender. It was a bitter, gut-wrenching decision, the first mass surrender of an American division's elements in Europe. Yet, with dawn about to break on the fourth day, the order went out: destroy weapons, burn maps and code books, and prepare to capitulate. Day 4, December 19th, 1944. As a pale winter morning light crept over the treetops, a strange quiet fell on the Schnee Eifel. The crackling firefights of previous days ceased. White flags, improvised from bedsheets, undershirts, anything white, began fluttering from foxholes and bunker slits. In small clusters, American soldiers stood up from their positions with hands raised. A hush of unreality descended after days of chaos, an eerie calm as the guns went silent one by one. The German forces cautiously approached, unsure at first if this was a trick, but it was real. At around 9 a.m., the U.S. 422nd and 423rd Regiments formally surrendered on the Schnee Eifel. Nearly 7,000 American soldiers laid down their arms, the largest single capitulation of U.S. troops in the European theater of the war. It was, as one historian described, the most serious reverse suffered by American arms in Europe. The proud Golden Lions Division had been effectively destroyed in its very first battle. For the men on the ground, surrender was a jarring and somber scene. Exhausted GIs stumbled out of their foxholes, tossing their rifles and helmets onto piles. Some wept in frustration or hung their heads in shame. Others were simply too numb and cold to feel anything but relief that the ordeal was over. The Germans moved among them, disarming the troops and herding them into ragged columns. Here and there, angry Wehrmacht NCOs shouted orders in German, prodding the Americans to get moving. But many of the German soldiers, young and war-weary themselves, simply stared in amazement. They had just captured an entire American division, more prisoners than they knew what to do with. In the mingling of victors and vanquished, remarkable human moments occurred. German infantrymen, after days of fighting on half rations, began rifling through the Americans' abandoned packs and pockets in search of food or souvenirs. What they found left them astounded. One German private pulled a small cardboard box from a GI's pack, emblazoned with "Breakfast Unit." Opening it, he discovered crackers, a packet of coffee, and a bar of Hershey's chocolate, along with a few cigarettes and chewing gum. He called over a comrade, marveling that die Amis, the Yanks, even put sweet chocolate and gum in a combat ration. For German soldiers accustomed to sparse field rations, it was almost unbelievable. American wealth and comfort manifested in a simple K-Ration box. Some Germans gleefully pocketed the candy and lit up the captured American cigarettes on the spot. Indeed, witnesses recall seeing German troops that morning puffing on Lucky Strikes and Camels taken off the prisoners, a bittersweet taste of the abundance their enemy enjoyed. For the Americans, the emotions ranged from humiliation to a strange camaraderie in misery. We were no longer fighters, just cold, hungry men, one GI remembered years later. As a column of prisoners formed on a forest road, a battle-weary German sergeant offered a light to an American soldier whose hands were shaking too hard to spark a match. The American inhaled the gifted cigarette gratefully, the smoke soothing his frayed nerves for a moment. Another GI, trembling with cold, reached into his coat and pulled out a final treasure, a slightly melted chocolate bar. Rather than eat it himself, he broke it in half and wordlessly pressed a piece into the hand of a nearby German guard who had been kind to them. The young German, surprised, nodded in thanks and savored the unexpected sweetness. On that wintry road, 6 daily cigarettes and a precious chocolate bar met not as tools of propaganda or morale, but as simple human comforts shared between former enemies. In that brief exchange, the line between American and German blurred. They were just soldiers, exhausted, far from home, indulging in a moment of peace over tobacco and chocolate. Under armed escort, the long file of American prisoners trudged eastward. That very day, many of them were paraded past astonished German field commanders who could hardly believe the haul of prisoners. Eventually, they were packed into rail cars and sent off to POW camps deeper in Germany. The plight of these men was only beginning. They would endure harsh winter marches, overcrowded prison camps, and scant rations. Ironically, now they would dream of chocolate and cigarettes as unattainable luxuries. Among their number was a young private named Kurt Vonnegut, who would survive captivity and later write of it in Slaughterhouse 5. But in December 1944, these thousands of captured GIs disappeared behind barbed wire, their war effectively over. For the 106th Division, the Ardennes had been an unimaginable baptism by fire. Out of approximately 14,000 men, over half were now dead, wounded, or prisoners within a span of 4 days. The impact of the 106th's stand and collapse reverberated across the Battle of the Bulge. In purely military terms, the surrender on the Schnee-Eifel was a tactical disaster for the Americans. However, it was not without a sliver of silver lining. The stubborn resistance of the Golden Lions, even in defeat, imposed a crucial delay on the German timetable. The German 5th Panzer Army had to devote time and troops to corralling those 2 regiments, and the fight for St. Vith, just to the west, was also stiffening. General Manteuffel later admitted that the unexpected dogged defense by American units, including the pocket on the Schnee-Eifel and the stand at St. Vith, threw his whole offensive off schedule by 3 days. Those 3 days were priceless. They gave the Allies time to rush reinforcements like the 82nd and 101st Airborne into the fray and allowed the encircled crossroads town of Bastogne to hold. By the time Manteuffel's panzers finally captured St. Vith and broke through elsewhere, the German advance was running out of fuel and facing growing Allied counterattacks. The sacrifice of the 106th, though tragic, helped slow the German drive enough for the Bulge to ultimately be contained. As the German Army's Chief of Staff later reflected, the Ardennes offensive was a gamble doomed by our lack of time and resources. The stand of units like the 106th ensured the Wehrmacht never obtained that time. For the Allies, news of the mass surrender was initially hushed. It was a blow to morale to hear that an American division had been effectively wiped out. But as the war moved on, the 106th Infantry Division's story became one of lessons learned. It highlighted the dangers of underestimating the enemy and overextending lines. It also underscored the incredible resolve that citizen soldiers could display in hopeless circumstances. The Ghost Front was a ghost no more. It became a bloody classroom in combat leadership and endurance. In the snowy Ardennes woods where the Golden Lions made their last stand, the guns eventually fell silent. Weeks later, as Allied forces retook that ground in January 1945, they found scenes of devastation: charred tanks, shattered bunkers, and discarded ration cartons scattered in the snow. Among the debris were poignant reminders of the men who had fought there: empty Hershey's chocolate wrappers, American cigarette packs, and German tobacco pouches left behind in the melting snow. These humble artifacts told a human story within the grand narrative of the battle. The opening scene of our story began on a quiet ridge with small pleasures: a morning smoke, a bite of chocolate, and ended 4 days later in hunger, smoke, and surrender. The meeting of 6 cigarettes a day and chocolate in every K-Ration on the Schnee-Eifel was a meeting of 2 worlds: the gritty, resource-starved resolve of the German soldier and the homespun comfort and abundance carried by the American GI. In the end, both were overwhelmed by the fierceness of war's reality. On that freezing December ridge, those cigarettes and chocolates, symbols of morale and normalcy, became tokens of compassion shared between enemies turned prisoners of fate. The Battle of the Bulge would rage on into January, but the tale of the 106th Division stands out as a stark microcosm of the conflict's human element. It reminds us that war is not just about grand strategies or mighty weapons. It's also about terrified young men in foxholes, clutching at any scrap of comfort: a stick of gum, a square of chocolate, a few cigarettes. In peace these are trifles, but in war they can mean the difference between despair and the will to carry on. As the dust settled on the Ardennes, the Schnee-Eifel returned to its ghostly quiet, now littered with the ghosts of a broken division. Yet, in that stillness, we find a final image: an American POW and a German guard, standing together in the snow for a brief moment, sharing a smoke from the same pack. Their breath mingles with cigarette smoke in the icy air, and perhaps they exchange a few words or simply a nod. Both are far from home. Both have seen too much in too few days. In that fragile moment of shared humanity, the war briefly melts away. How 6 cigarettes a day met chocolate in every K-ration is more than just a catchy phrase. It encapsulates the collision of two armies' ways of life amid one of history's greatest battles. The Ardennes offensive failed, and a few months later, the war in Europe would be over. But the memory of those small comforts and their role in soldiers' lives endures. It's a poignant footnote that on the front lines of World War II, the world's best-fed army and one of the world's most resource-strapped army both carried a piece of morale in their kits, be it tobacco or chocolate, and in extreme moments, even traded them. In the final reflection, the Ghost Front's lesson is clear. War strips everything to its essentials. When all the grand designs fall apart, what remains are ordinary humans trying to survive another day, sharing simple luxuries amid hardship. A cigarette, a chocolate bar. In December 1944, these humble items bridged enemies and offered a brief solace when nothing else was certain. As viewers and readers, we are left with that thought. Sometimes, the smallest things speak louder about the experience of war than any statistics or battle maps. On Schnee Eifel, in the winter of 1944, a bit of smoke and a bit of sweetness transcended the divide of nations. A fleeting moment of peace in the midst of carnage, and a reminder that humanity persists even in the darkest of times. Through smoke and frost, through defeat and determination, the story of the 106th Division's Ardennes ordeal lives on, a stark, sobering saga of how cigarettes and chocolate, courage and sacrifice all met on one cold battlefield, and how that meeting quietly shaped the course of a battle and lives in World War II.